Honored to be able to appear here today to discuss the path forward in U.S.-Zimbabwe relations. I served as U.S. Ambassador to Zimbabwe from 2009 to 2012 during the period of the ZANU-PF MDC coalition government, a time of relative peace and a certain amount of economic stability, but unfortunately also a time of lost opportunities to put Zimbabwe on the path of a truly representative government and a prosperous economy. Most Americans probably know very little about Zimbabwe, but for a brief time this past November, it was again very prominent in the American media. After several weeks of increasing political turmoil, primarily within Mugabe's ruling party, the first Vice President, Emmerson Mnangagwa, was accused of disloyalty and sacked. He then fled to South Africa, claiming that his life was in danger. Around the same time, Mugabe's wife, Grace, began to appear more and more in public, stating that she should be the one to succeed the aging leader, statements that Mugabe, to his discredit, did nothing to deny. An unprecedented for Zimbabwe move, General Constantine Chiwenga, Chief of the Defense Staff, made a public statement that the military would not stand idly by and allow liberation figures to be removed from the government or from the party. He was accused of treason, but shortly thereafter the military made its move. It took control of key installations in Harare, placed Mugabe and his family under effective house arrest, although it was very quick to publicly state this is not a coup. But as one opposition figure said, if it looks like a duck and it walks like a duck, it's a duck. Make no mistake about it, even though it was a palace coup with the military moving against members of its own party or the party that it supports, it was, in fact, a coup d'etat. A relatively nonviolent one and done in a most unusual way. Mugabe was allowed to meet with the press, to engage in a phone conversation with the former president of South Africa, and his meeting with the leader of the coup, with General Chiwenga, at least on the surface, appeared to be very cordial, and he was even allowed to call a cabinet meeting. But it was still a change of government initiated by force of arms rather than through the ballot box. However, how the military's actions in this case will be dealt with, I think, is something for Zimbabweans to handle. For the rest of the world, and for the U.S. in particular, I think the key questions now are, where is Zimbabwe going from here, and what role should we play in that journey? We should start, I think, with a bit of background on the new interim president, Emmerson Mnangagwa. I think the question on many minds is, will he be any different from Mugabe? He is, after all, someone who worked closely with Mugabe for more than 37 years after the country's independence and served as an intelligence officer during the War for Independence, and who, because of his actions in support of the crackdown on the Ndebele political opposition in the 1980s and MDC supporters in the 1990s, has earned the nickname the Crocodile. Prior to being appointed to the first vice president position, Mnangagwa served as defense minister and also as justice minister. Though he lacks Mugabe's charisma, it appears that he enjoys the firm support of many of the senior military officials. I think moving forward, his first priority will be to reassert control over ZANU-PF, a party that is fractured along generational lines, with many of those in their 40s and 50s, known as the G40, supporting Grace Mugabe against the older Liberation-era party members. A united ZANU-PF is essential if the party is to retain power. This won't be an easy task for Mnangagwa, as the rift between the two demographics was worsened by some of the actions and rhetoric during September and November of last year. The issue is further complicated by the presence of former ZANU-PF No. 2, Joyce Mujuru. She was first vice president until she was canned a few years ago. She is now the head of the People First, or ZIM-PF, party. Until Grace Mugabe engineered her ouster, she was in competition with Mnangagwa to be Mugabe's successor. A veteran of the liberation struggle, as a fighter with a fierce reputation, she also enjoys some military support, although probably not as much as Mnangagwa. His second priority, I believe, will be to ensure ZANU-PF's continued control of power in the country. If he can somehow pull all of the factions together and overcome the possible threat from Mujuru, he will have to decide whether or not to proceed with elections in July 2018. I realize that he has publicly stated that he will, but we will have to see what really happens. While violence and chicanery are still possibilities that cannot be cavalierly dismissed, a united ZANU-PF is likely to be able to do well against the current opposition party lineup. The Movement for Democratic Change, or MDC, is still split between the faction led by the late Morgan Tsvangirai, now with an interim president, Nelson Chamisa, and the one led by Welcome Nube. As the parties that pose the greatest challenge to ZANU-PF, especially in the urban areas, if they were united, they would surely do well, but it's unlikely that they will unite. The remainder of the opposition parties, with the exception of Joyce Mujuru's party, will only take votes away from the two MDCs, which is to ZANU-PF's advantage, unfortunately. In the rural areas, ZANU-PF has, in the past at least, had an advantage, and Mnangagwa is sure to capitalize on this. So while it's too early to predict that the 2018 elections will be free, fair, and nonviolent, let's assume for a moment that they will be. Where do we go from that point? During my time as ambassador to Zimbabwe, one of the most frequent topics of conversation was U.S. sanctions. Put in place in response to the violent land seizures and electoral violence of the late 1990s, the Zimbabwe Democracy and Economic Recovery Act, or ZEDERA, was passed in December 2001, and a presidential executive order targeting individuals and entities involved in the violence and other anti-democratic acts was issued in March 2003. Both of these actions were intended to encourage a return to democracy and representative government, something that had not happened by the time of my arrival in 2009. After the MDC won the 2008 elections, although without the necessary 51% majority, there was more violence. But under South African pressure, a coalition government was formed. That government, with the MDC in a decidedly subordinate position to ZANU-PF, lasted until the 2014 elections, in which ZANU-PF got the required majority and subsequently formed a government without the MDC. The sanctions, in my view, were clearly not having the desired effect, and Mugabe's party's hardliners were using their existence as an excuse for every ill that the country suffered. My response to the many questions of when will the sanctions be lifted was when there is a return to nonviolent elections and democracy. In fact, during one of my final media interviews before I departed in 2012, I said that sanctions were a response to a violent electoral process. A credible electoral process free of violence would make our current policy somewhat irrelevant. If this year's elections are held, if they're determined to be credible, and if there is no violence, the ball will be in our court. If we truly want to see Zimbabwe develop to its potential, we must be prepared to work with the winner of a credible, nonviolent election, regardless of the political party. Even if the election is credible and nonviolent, any new government is almost certain to contain officials who bring a lot of historical baggage with them to their positions. I firmly believe, however, that we should, in such a situation, put the past behind us and focus on the policy statement and the introduction of ZEDERA. It is the policy of the United States to support the people of Zimbabwe in their struggle to effect peaceful, democratic change, achieve broad-based and equitable economic growth, and restore the rule of law. I leave development of the precise modalities of our actions to the policymakers and the professionals in the foreign and civil services of our foreign affairs agencies, primarily state and aid, but I would offer a few humble suggestions on a way forward. First, I think we should instruct our embassy in Harare to make contact with Mnangagwa and his current government to reiterate firmly our policy regarding sanctions and to inform him if upcoming elections are credible and nonviolent, we are prepared to recognize and work with the new government. While we would continue to monitor the human rights situation, our initial focus should be on actions to reinvigorate the country's economy and empower the private sector to revitalize the agricultural sector and rebuild stagnant industries with a view to creating meaningful employment and broad economic security. We should encourage the new government to develop an investor-friendly climate, take steps to curb corruption, while at the same time encourage American businesses to explore the opportunities to increase two-way trade and investment. You might note I said nothing about lifting sanctions. I think that should be the stick. The carrot, I think, would be our offer to deal with the government. The stick is, if they don't deal, sanctions stay in place. During my time as ambassador, we experimented with a local economic development program modeled on an Asian village financing scheme that I encountered